Welcome to our deep dive into the history of flight and pilot certification. Today, we'll be using the FAA's Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge as our primary source. Get ready for some fascinating stories, from those first attempts at flight to the complex world of modern aviation.
Oh, it's a fascinating journey for sure. Humans have been obsessed with flying for ages.
It's true. The handbook mentions birdmen trying to copy birds, and of course, Leonardo da Vinci's designs.
Yeah, Da Vinci, always ahead of his time. But it took a while to figure out we couldn't just imitate birds. Our muscles just aren't built for those giant flapping wings.
That makes sense. So how did we finally get off the ground?
Balloons, hot air and gas balloons were a big step. They figured out lift, but control was a problem.
I can imagine. At the mercy of the wind, no way to steer.
Yes, exactly. Not exactly a reliable mode of transportation.
What was the key to finally figuring out controlled flight?
You might be surprised to learn that it was the kite.
The kite, really? Like a toy?
Yep. Sir George Cayley, called the father of aerial navigation, saw the potential of kites back in the early 1800s.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did kites reveal about flight?
Kites demonstrate some pretty important aerodynamic principles, like how lift is generated by airflow over a tilted surface. That tilt's called the angle of attack.
Ah, I see. So a simple kite held clues to heavier-than-air flight. Amazing.
And kites also show how lift can be controlled, leading to stability and maneuverability. Cayley used this knowledge to develop gliders.
Gliders. So Cayley's work with kites basically paved the way for the Wright brothers.
You could say that. His work was foundational to the scientific and engineering progress leading up to their famous 1903 flight at Kitty Hawk.
The Wright brothers. Their story really captured the world's imagination. But the handbook mentioned something that blew my mind. A scheduled airline in the U.S. before their flight. Is that possible?
It's true. The St. Petersburg-Tampa airboat line started in 1914. It ran for 4 months and carried over 1,200 passengers, without any recorded incidents.
An airboat airline. That's wild. I would never have guessed that.
And get this, it wasn't even planes, but airboats.
That's incredible. So what happened to the airboat airline? And how did we go from these early experiments to the complex air travel system we have today?
Well, World War I played a big role. It accelerated the development of aircraft, mainly for military purposes. After the war, the focus shifted to peacetime applications, especially airmail.
So airmail delivery helped shape early aviation infrastructure? That's interesting.
Absolutely. The U.S. established the transcontinental airmail route, which was crucial for things like lighted beacons for night flying, designated landing fields, and developing more reliable and powerful aircraft.
I can see how that would lay the groundwork for a more organized system.
Exactly. And it led to the Air Commerce Act of 1926, a law designed to both foster and regulate this booming industry.
It sounds like the government saw the potential of aviation and wanted to make sure it grew safely and efficiently.
You got it. The Air Commerce Act created the Aeronautics branch, the predecessor to the FAA.
So the early focus of the Aeronautics branch was on safety.
Primarily, yes. They started issuing pilot licenses, with the very first one going to William McCracken Jr. in 1927.
That's amazing. So the very first pilot license was issued almost 100 years ago.
It was. And believe it or not, Orville Wright actually declined to be the first licensed pilot.
Really? Why would he turn that down? I mean, that's a huge honor.
The handbook doesn't say, but it definitely adds a little mystery, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Around that same time, they also began issuing airworthiness certificates for aircraft, making sure they met certain safety standards. These were really the early steps towards the standardized and rigorous system we have today.
From kites to airboats, from airmail to the birth of the FAA, it's incredible how quickly aviation progressed. But with more planes taking to the skies, things must have started getting a little crowded. How did they handle the increasing air traffic back then?
That's where air traffic control comes in. It started very simply, with controllers using, believe it or not, maps and chalkboards to track aircraft.
Chalkboards. That's almost unbelievable when you consider the sophisticated radar and computer systems they use today.
It is quite a contrast, isn't it? Those early controllers had their work cut out for them.
It must have been challenging to keep up with the rapid growth of aviation.
Absolutely, and that brings us to a pivotal moment in U.S. aviation. Deregulation. The Airline Deregulation Act of 1978 changed everything, creating a whole new set of opportunities and challenges.
Deregulation. Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting. Tell me more about what happened when the airline industry was deregulated. So we left off talking about deregulation. It sounds like it would have been a really big change for the aviation world.
It was a huge shift. Before deregulation, the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB, had really tight control over everything. They set fares, they determined routes. Basically, the CAB decided who could fly where and how much they could charge.
So it was a pretty regulated system.
Very much so. But the 1978 Act changed all that. It phased out the CAB, and with it went all those controls.
So airlines were suddenly free to set their own prices and routes.
Exactly. They could compete for customers, offer different fares, try new routes.
That sounds like it could have both good and bad outcomes.
It did. On the one hand, the increased competition led to some really good things, like lower fares. Air travel became much more affordable, which meant more people could fly.
That makes sense. Lower prices usually mean more people can afford something.
Right. And passenger volume really took off as airlines competed for those customers. But as you might imagine, it wasn't all smooth sailing after deregulation.
The handbook did mention something about a major strike.
Yeah, that was a big one. The Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, or PATTICO, went on strike in 1981.
What were they striking about?
Well, they wanted better pay, shorter working hours, and improved equipment. They felt like the huge increase in air travel after deregulation was putting a lot of strain on them, and the system wasn't keeping up.
So deregulation created this surge in air travel, which put pressure on the air traffic control system. And the controllers felt like they were bearing the brunt of it.
Yeah, they felt overworked and undervalued. It was a really tense time.
So what happened with the strike?
Well, it became a turning point in labor relations in the airline industry. President Reagan took a very firm stance. He ended up firing over 11,000 striking controllers.
Wow, over 11,000? That's a huge number of people.
It was a significant portion of the workforce. The FAA had to scramble to train replacements, reorganize the whole system.
That must have been incredibly disruptive.
It was a challenging time for everyone involved. And the effects of that strike are still debated today. Some people argue that it led to long-term staffing and morale issues within the FAA. Others say it was absolutely necessary to maintain air safety and prevent similar disruptions in the future.
It's a powerful reminder that behind all the technology and those amazing stories of flight, there are real people with really demanding jobs that make it all possible. So deregulation led to cheaper fares, but also this huge labor dispute. What other challenges did the FAA face as the aviation industry kept growing?
Well, security became a major concern, especially with the rise of terrorism and hijackings. And then, of course, September 11th, 2001 happened. That changed everything.
It did. Airport security was never the same after 9/11.
Right. The FAA had to completely overhaul airport security. They were central in developing and implementing all those new protocols and technologies we see today.
What other challenges emerged during that time?
Well, environmental concerns started getting more attention. The FAA had to address noise pollution from aircraft, especially around airports, and they had to start thinking about the environmental impact of aviation in general, like exploring alternative fuels and more sustainable practices.
It sounds like the FAA's role was expanding beyond just safety regulations. They were starting to manage the impact of aviation on society as a whole.
That's a good way to put it. And that evolution continues today as they tackle things like regulating drones, integrating unmanned aircraft into the national airspace.
Drones. Yeah, it feels like they've just exploded in popularity in the last few years.
They have, and their potential uses are growing so fast. Package delivery, aerial photography, infrastructure inspection, even things we haven't thought of yet.
It's exciting, but I can see why drones would need their own set of regulations.
Absolutely. It's essential to make sure they're operated safely and don't interfere with traditional air traffic. The FAA is busy developing new rules and guidelines, constantly adapting to this rapidly changing technology.
It's a good reminder that aviation is dynamic, always evolving. The pilot's handbook really emphasized that, especially when it comes to pilot certification.
It does. The handbook does a really good job of outlining all the different pilot certifications, from sport pilot to airline transport pilot, what they allow you to do, the training requirements. There's a path for just about every kind of flying you can imagine.
It is cool how there are different paths you can take depending on your goals. When we talk about those different certifications, what are the options for someone who's interested in becoming a pilot?
Sure. Well, the Sport Pilot Certificate is the newest category. It was designed to make flying more accessible, especially for recreational purposes.
So it's a good entry point for someone who wants to try out flying.
Exactly. It only requires a minimum of 20 hours of flight time, and it allows you to fly light sport aircraft under certain conditions.
So sport pilot is for someone who wants to fly for fun.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for long distances or in really busy airspace.
Right. If you want a bit more freedom than the sport pilot license, there's the recreational pilot certificate.
What are the requirements for that one?
You need 30 hours of flight time, and you can carry one passenger. But there's still limitations on how far you can fly and what kind of airspace you can operate in.
I see. So more freedom, but still geared towards recreational flying. What about people who want to fly professionally?
For that, you'll need a private pilot certificate. It's the most common certificate for pilots who fly for pleasure or personal business.
What are the main differences between the recreational pilot certificate and the private pilot certificate?
The private pilot certificate requires at least 40 hours of flight time, including solo flights and cross-country experience. With a private pilot certificate, you can fly pretty much anywhere in the U.S., carry passengers, and even share expenses with them.
Okay, so lots of freedom there. But you still can't get paid to fly, right?
Right. If you want to make a career out of flying, you'll need a commercial pilot certificate.
That's the big leagues.
It is. With a commercial pilot certificate, you can be paid to fly, but the training is much more demanding. You need a really deep understanding of aircraft systems. You have to be able to perform more complex maneuvers. And the standards of airmanship are higher, of course.
What are some of the things that make the training more demanding?
Well, to earn a commercial certificate, you need to be proficient in flying a complex airplane.
A complex airplane. What does that mean exactly?
It means an aircraft with retractable landing gear, flaps, and a controllable pitch propeller. Each of those features adds another layer of complexity to how the plane operates.
Why is that? Why do those features make it more complex to fly?
Because each one has to be managed correctly. Retractable landing gear has to be deployed and retracted at the right speeds and altitudes. Flaps change the shape of the wing, they increase lift at lower speeds. And a controllable pitch propeller lets the pilot adjust the angle of the blades for optimal performance during different phases of flight.
I can see how that would make things more challenging.
And a commercial pilot needs to understand how all these systems work together, how to operate them safely and efficiently.
Makes sense. So what about the pilots who fly those massive airliners? That seems like a whole different level of expertise.
Absolutely. To fly those, you need an airline transport pilot or ATP certificate.
ATP, that's the top of the pyramid, right?
It is. It's the highest level of piloting certification, and it's required to be a captain or first officer on scheduled airline operations. The requirements are tough: 1,500 hours of flight time, rigorous training, and some very demanding written and practical tests.
1,500 hours of flight time. That's incredible. It really underscores the huge responsibility involved in flying hundreds of passengers.
It does. And even with all that experience and training, pilots are constantly learning and refining their skills.
The handbook also mentions something called a restricted ATP certificate.
Oh, right, the restricted ATP. That allows pilots to serve as a second-in-command or first officer on airline flights with 1,000 hours of flight time if they have a bachelor's degree, or 12,250 hours without a degree.
So it's a pathway to becoming an airline pilot, but with a slightly lower flight time requirement.
Yeah. It was created to address the increasing demand for airline pilots while still maintaining high safety standards.
It's amazing to see this whole range of pilot certifications, each with its own path and requirements. It's inspiring to think that anyone who has the passion and dedication can pursue their dream of flying, whether it's for fun or as a profession.
It is. And it's not just about racking up those flight hours. The FAA really stresses the importance of finding a good flight school and, maybe even more importantly, the right flight instructor.
I can see how a great mentor could make all the difference, especially in a field where safety is so crucial. The handbook mentions something called scenario-based training. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a key part of how pilots are trained today. It's about preparing them for real-world situations they might encounter up in the air. Instead of just practicing basic maneuvers over and over, instructors put their students through realistic scenarios.
So it's about learning to think like a pilot, not just how to fly a plane.
Exactly. Scenario-based training challenges them to think critically, make good decisions, manage risks, communicate effectively, especially under pressure.
How does it actually work? Do they just imagine these scenarios, or is it more hands-on?
It can involve all sorts of things: simulations, flight simulators, even real-world flights with the instructor acting as a safety pilot.
So they actually get to experience these challenges firsthand.
They do. The scenarios can be pretty simple, like dealing with unexpected weather conditions, or they can get really complex, like engine failures or medical emergencies. The point is to help pilots develop those skills and build the confidence they need to handle anything that comes their way.
That makes so much sense. It's not just about knowing the mechanics of flying the plane, it's about knowing how to think quickly and stay calm when things go wrong.
You got it. And it all connects to those other concepts the FAA talks about. Aeronautical decision-making, risk management, crew resource management, all essential for safe and responsible flying.
Aeronautical decision-making, that sounds pretty important. What does that entail?
It's all about developing a systematic way to assess risk and make good decisions in flight. Pilots are taught to identify hazards, figure out how serious they are, consider different courses of action, and then they have to make a decision based on the best information available.
So it's like a mental checklist to help pilots stay safe.
You could think of it that way. It gives them a framework for thinking through those tough situations. And then there's crew resource management, or CRM. That's all about teamwork in the cockpit.
Yeah, that makes sense. Even though flying can feel like a solo activity, there's a whole crew up there in those big airliners.
Right. And CRM recognizes that everyone makes mistakes, even experienced pilots. So it emphasizes clear communication, being aware of what's going on around you, supporting each other.
So it's about creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable speaking up, sharing information.
Exactly. It's about working together to make sure everyone is safe.
It's fascinating to see how all these pieces come together, all the different elements that go into making aviation so safe, even with all its complexities.
It's a tribute to the hard work and dedication of so many people. Engineers, mechanics, air traffic controllers, pilots, all working together to make aviation as safe and efficient as possible. It's a remarkable achievement.
We've talked about so many different aspects of aviation. It's been a really fascinating journey. The Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge also talks about all these resources that the FAA makes available to anyone. They sound incredibly helpful for anyone interested in flying or just learning more.
Oh, they're amazing. The FAA has done a great job of making all sorts of information available, and they've made it really accessible, too.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, there's the Aeronautical Information Manual, or AIM, for example. That's like the essential guide for pilots in the United States.
Like the Bible for pilots.
Exactly. It covers just about everything you need to know to fly safely and legally in the U.S. Basic flight info, air traffic control procedures, weather, airspace classifications, how airports operate, emergency procedures, even a whole glossary of aviation terms.
Wow. It's really comprehensive then.
It is, and anyone can access it.
Wait, really? Anyone can get this pilot's Bible?
Yep. It's a public document. You can download it for free right from the FAA's website. They've really made it easy to get your hands on all this information.
That's fantastic. So the AM is like this comprehensive guide for flying in the U.S. What other kinds of resources does the FAA offer?
They have a whole library of handbooks.
Yeah.
And they cover all sorts of specific topics, different types of aircraft, instrument flying, pilot training, maintenance, even guidance for flight examiners.
So they really go deep into the details.
Oh, yeah. They're packed with info, really helpful for pilots, mechanics, instructors, anyone involved in aviation.
It's amazing that they offer so much for free. It shows how committed they are to safety and education. But things change so quickly in aviation, especially with technology. How do they keep all this information current?
That's a good question. The FAA is always updating their stuff. The publications, the resources, everything. They want to make sure everything reflects the latest technology, the current regulations, the best practices.
Right.
They also use a system called Notices to Airmen, or NOTAMs.
NOTAMs? What are those?
They're like urgent alerts for pilots. Essential information about any hazards or any changes that affect flight safety. And these changes can be temporary.
So it's stuff pilots need to know before they fly.
Absolutely. Things like runway closures, airspace restrictions if there's a special event or a military exercise going on, changes to instrument approach procedures, maybe a navigational aid is down. They might even have reports of unusual bird activity or volcanic ash.
So basically, NOTAMs make sure pilots have the most up-to-date information.
Right, and pilots have to check NOTAMs before every single flight. It's their responsibility.
How do they get those NOTAMs?
Lots of ways. Flight service stations, those are FAA facilities. They provide pre-flight briefings and weather information. And there are online databases, smartphone apps, all kinds of ways to stay informed.
So the FAA is really using technology to get this critical information out there.
They are. They're always innovating, trying to improve safety and efficiency.
It's impressive to see how much they do to ensure safe skies.
Definitely. And all these resources aren't just for pilots. They're for anyone who wants to learn more about this amazing field.
It's incredible how far aviation has come. We've come a long way from those early days of just dreaming about flight. From birdmen and kites to airliners and drones, human ingenuity is truly amazing.
It is, and that journey is far from over. With technology changing so rapidly, who knows what the future holds for aviation? It's an exciting time to be following this incredible story.